Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the second edition of the Conference on Applied Geodesic Engineer 2022, which is being organized by SIGGMA, the Society of Geodetic Engineers, Geomatics, and Surveyors of Venezuela, the AAPG Universidad del Zulia Student Chapter, and the Satellite and Physical Geodesy Laboratory, Dr. Melvin Hoyer. My name is Alexander Gonzalez, and I had the pleasure to be the moderator for today's sessions. On behalf of the event organizing committee, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to attend today's webinar named The Truth of Matter, presented by John Connor. As a matter of introduction, Mr. John Connor graduated from Louisiana State University in New Orleans with a BA in English and a minor in math on a GI Bill, following 4 years in the U.S. Air Force as an aircraft loadmaster and Vietnam veteran. While in school, he worked for a company that was developing the first digital technology for digitizing oil and gas well logs. He cross-trained from computer operator to software engineer after taking a programmer aptitude test at IBM. Then he transferred to Houston in 1971, working with well log analysts, creating software to generate colorized geologic lithology plots. In 1982, he formed Ensoco Incorporated with 2 partners, which provide specialized processing, position problem solving, onshore and offshore mapping, and integrated mapping. In Ensoco, held contact with most major oil and gas companies, oil service companies, and international oil companies until 2017, when they closed. He was the past 2005-2006 vice chairman and 2007 chairman of the Association of Petroleum Survey and Geomatics, APSG, and a founding member of the present chairman of the Education Foundation, a task force focused on K-12 at-risk adult education and graduate and postgraduate support in survey and geomatics. John is also a founding member of G Forensics, a consulting company currently supporting multiple organizations and private landowners dealing with orphan wells, whose focus is on the issue of geolocation misrepresentation, which is indeed the main topic of this webinar. For any comment or question you may have during this presentation, please, there will be a QA session at the end. Please feel free to write them down in the question section on this platform, and if the times allow us, we will try to answer them accordingly. With great pleasure, I want to welcome again to our guest speaker, John Connor. Thank you, Mr. Connor, for joining us. The mic is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. I appreciate the opportunity given by SIGGMA to allow us to present this talk. It is actually entitled The Truth of the Matter. It is a very simple truth, and that's that any data associated with an asset becomes uncertain if its geolocation is uncertain. And that is primarily the thing that we wish to point out in doing this presentation is the issues of misrepresentation. Now, I'd like to start with the fact that people often ask who G Forensic is and what does the G stand for, and some like to think it's for grumpy old men, which is in part probably true. And then also there's the possibility of us being geriatrics, which we deny, although we may look like it sometimes. But actually, the G stands for geomatics, and it is our education, our backgrounds, our work experience that we apply to solving problems of misrepresentation. And we try to work with companies like landowners, or I'm sorry, people like landowners, certain associations, foundations, state and federal agencies, anyone that is really interested in what is the potential risk of geolocation misrepresentation. So the talk will be broken down into multiple sections. First will be the historical problems associated with geolocation, then the magnitude of the problem, especially in the US, and we'd like to point out that this is not solely a US problem, but there are risks to life, property, and the environment. We talk a little bit about the failure in data capture and data integrity. Then our work in Texas counties and local ranches in the Permian, and what proactive steps should be taken to solve these issues. So if we start down the history ladder, if you will, the issues come about due to survey methods and advancement in survey methods and change in survey methods. Position types, meaning for wells, how a well is defined from its inception to its actual drilling, and is there the possibility of multiple positions being involved in that, and are they often exchanged as being the same? Finally, datum and coordinate reference systems, which I'm sure Cliff Monnier talked about in some detail earlier. Multiple copies of data, or the silo issue that everybody's aware of, misuse and human error, lack of data governance on positional information, and the proprietary nature of wells. And this is really the primary reasons why we end up with geolocation misrepresentation. So we'll start out with ownership and physical boundaries. And I'd like to point out that this probably goes back to the original cavemen who found a nice place to stay, had lots of potential sources of food, and they likely marked the boundaries of their territory to keep others out. And so this was probably the first form of physical boundaries for ownership. That advanced into the 19th century, where we were still using physical properties to define land ownership. And you could see the meets and bounds presented here, where you might have some trees, and then at a certain distance and angle, there could be something else, and then more measurements. So ultimately you come up with a boundary defined by physical presence, and that becomes a legal description of the land. As we move forward, we started to see changes in geodesy. We started to see the advancement of map projections and the use of map projections to define geolocation, and also the advent of land grids to help to define property and property ownership. And there are multiple forms of these types of systems that exist. Texas is extremely lucky, or unlucky, if you will, because we've sampled just about all the methods there are for defining land grids. But these types of systems eventually back calculate into geolocation, and that's another source of problems for misrepresentation. And it probably starts for wells with the advent of the survey plat. surveyors would go out, would find some physical evidence of the advancement of land grids, and with that they would use those physical markers to define boundaries, and then they would measure from those boundaries to where the well was supposedly going to be drilled. And these were used in the form of footage calls, and they're still used today as the way that they're presented into regulatory agencies about where the wells are. The problem is, as these boundaries have changed, as the methods for doing the determination of the distances and what they were measured from changed, we see differences. And for instance, if you look at the Railroad Commission land grid, we pull into Global Mapper, we measure the distances, and we find that they are different from what the plats were called or called for, and you can see pretty significant changes in it. And that's just the natural progression of knowledge. But unfortunately, coordinates may have been created from these calls, and so they may actually misrepresent the actual location that we might be able to determine today. If we go on to the next step, suddenly my mouse isn't working. I'll do it over here. There we go. As we moved into modern positioning technology, certainly with the advent of GPS, we were able to build networks and grids to allow us to do precise location. And through precise location, we're able to better determine where physical assets are. Unfortunately, because of the methodologies that are used for positioning, those precise locations don't always match what the location is in a given data store. And in this instance, we could actually get out, measure the wellhead or the pump jack, if you will, and the sucker rod that pumps up and down. And it was 130 feet away from the position that was within the regulatory agency's data store. And I'll speak to that, those issues a little bit later on. The next step was position types. I mentioned that. We have positions that start with the planned location and the permitted location, and there may be one and the same, or they may not. Sometimes they would just go onto the property, pick a particular place and say, okay, this is where the wells are going to be, and we're going to submit to the regulatory agency for permission to drill on this site. And then they would actually come out and send a surveyor to stake the locations where the wells were going to be drilled. And there may be multiple stakes put out there for reasons of physical requirements of drilling. So the driller may come out and decide to use one of the 3 stakes or however many stakes there are, or he may just make a change on his own opinion. And so the wells may end up completely in a different location than here. And there could be multiple positions established for the wells. In this instance, this is older imagery, and we can actually see an image of the pump jack, and we can see another well over here. And one of them was plugged and abandoned, the 79.4 well, and the other one is still active, so you can see it even in modern imagery. But you have this potential problem of any of these positions being pulled back into use by multiple sources. So you could have multiple positions for the same exact well, and that's another form of misrepresentation. The other one is datum and coordinate reference identity. This is something I think most of you should be familiar with. As geomatics people, we understand the offsets. we can look at this and say, yeah, there's something different. It's this, in this case, it's a bias. So it's likely a difference in datums, but for the standard user working with multiple spatial references, they may not really understand this right away, and they may not even bother to ask anybody about it. They may just assume that there is a difference and it should be, the data should be shifted or moved to another position because they think that the underlying imagery is in what they want rather than the data points. So this is a problem of ignorance, if you will, because people are often handling geodetic data without an understanding of what data is referenced to and the issue of multiple reference systems. This is a diagram that I put together a few years ago. It has to do with the issue of silos. On the left-hand side, you can see a company definition of control, and they may have a corporate data store or database of which they do their data analytics. The analytics are passed through to management. Management makes business decisions. That's passed on to business units to act on it. They may control going out and doing the field survey. They may do the permitting. That may shift one type of a position into the regulatory agency, and another one stays internal to do their work. And so they may have a loop in here, but also the data may be passed on to commercial sources of processing, of other data stores and information providers. And so you have that the data here. These same people have access to the regulatory positions, and they may be pulling it in to use for somebody else's knowledge base. It's also public domain, so it has open access. It has no oversight. It's easily integrated into any data store. And so where does the data end up? How is it vetted? Is it even current? And then you may have another oil company over here who's working with this company, and they might have a completely different system and a way of handling data and governing that data. So you have this vicious loop of positions that are moving all over the place, virtually without any real control, even though an individual company might think they have very good control. Then you have the issue of misuse and human error, and I've simplified this. There's lots of ways for humans to make errors, and through misunderstanding or ignorance of a subject, they can do things to data that's quite surprising. But this one is a fairly common issue that I've seen multiple times, and that's the loss of precision in geodetic coordinates or in lat longs, where people don't really understand what the number of decimal places mean. They may be exporting something out of a workstation. It has a lat long, maybe for some reason, the latitude's defined as 4 decimal places and the longitude is 14 decimal places. And they don't really see that as being an issue or a way of degrading the accuracy of the coordinate reference. So then you have another geolocation issue that's being passed on to somebody else. And that sometimes they don't understand the variable formats that exist, and they often mistreat those as well. And many of us have seen, lat longs interspersed in lists of XY coordinates and vice versa. So these are kinds of problems of lack of understanding and lack of education that causes misrepresentation. Finally, the other two issues are lack of data governance and the proprietary nature of well data. And if you don't governance, if you don't perform governance on this data, if you don't ensure the integrity of it, then it has a real possibility of being corrupted, and that's the common source for corruption, is that nobody's controlling the information as it's being passed around. The other thing is that the geolocation of wells have always been considered proprietary. Sometimes it was the reason that they permitted at odd locations because they didn't want anybody else to know where they were drilling and what they were doing. But nowadays, with remote sensing and Earth observation, you can see what's going on in a well pad from point of inception all the way through to when it's P&A'd if you want to. And that's anywhere in the world. And it can start within a day of activity at somewhat low resolution. And then certainly within days, you can get ultra high resolution and be able to see exactly what's going on. So there really isn't any need anymore for at least the surface hole location to be considered proprietary. So now let's step on to the reason of the talk, and that's the magnitude of this problem in the US for estimated undocumented orphaned oil and gas wells. Now, these numbers were solicited from the states by this IOGCC group in 2019. They just basically went out and said to every state, every regulatory agency, tell us what the numbers are. Tell us how many wells you think are undocumented and how many you think you know about. And then they ranked them according to each state. And you can see Texas is somewhere in here. And actually the rankings are quite good. The numbers are unfortunately quite low and totally wrong from what in actuality exists. For instance, in Texas, there's roughly 1.2 million wells, and of those, about 5% of them are actually active. So you have a lot of idle wells, you have a lot of P&A wells, you have a lot of orphaned wells, all mixed together and confused between each other, but there are many more than what is actually said. They also look to try to determine what the cost for this number of wells would be to fix. And they came up with a number of 560,000 to 1.1 million wells that were truly orphaned and idled and needed to be fixed. And then they tried to figure out what the cost of that was, and they came up with a number of 4,000 to 100,000 with an average of 19,000 US dollars, or roughly 1.4 billion to do this range of wells that they estimated. That number is exceedingly low, as is the number to do the reclamation on the wells. And we have a real problem because we don't know when orphan well issues are going to stop. So it could be an ongoing problem or a future problem. So this is really everything that's been done in these two slides has to do with a reactive measure to handle what is visible. So the next topic is failures in data capture and integrity. And this one's really pretty simple to understand. If you don't understand geolocation and you don't understand well coordinates and what's necessary to identify that, then it's ignorance and it's a path to failure. If there is data integrity and people understand that geolocation is not just coordinates, that there's other information that's critical to understanding the geolocation. They need to understand that well location has multiple steps involved, so you could be dealing with more than one position for the same well. You need to resolve the data exchange issue, which is really critical because there is no governance of that. And then you need domain expertise involved in this whole process of people that understand wells. And it's the same thing for things like seismic data and pipeline data. All of them have the same kind of issues of lack of understanding, and many people, saying, oh, this is just a GIS problem. We'll throw all the data in here and we can figure it out from there. And that's not the path to success. That's the path to failure. So next is the work that we've done in Texas counties and for local ranchers in the Permian Basin. So we picked, or we actually talked to 3 landowners who had issues with leaking wells. We could have permission to go in and work their property to try to determine the magnitude of the misrepresentation problem. And some of the landowners had absolutely no mineral rights, so anything that was failing would be hopefully somebody else's responsibility, and they could go to those people to get things fixed. Some of them shared in the mineral rights, and some of them had a mixture of both. So our goal was for these landowners to go determine where the wells were and what the magnitude of geolocation misrepresentation was, to locate plugged and abandoned wells based on either visible features, historical information, documented evidence, looking in old imagery, and then we could report our findings back to the landowners about the wells and what their status was. And then we could also go at the same time through document research and help to identify the history of the operators involved, excuse me, and change in mineral ownership through the life cycle of each well, and to identify the API and well name, and then document our procedures and processes and provide those to the landowners. And there's a big issue here because a lot of this stuff is state. The liability is assigned differently in different states. And in some cases, like Texas, if a well was given to the landowner to be used as a water well, they would go below the water table, they would plug it there. The landowner would then be able to use it as a water well to fill their stock tanks or whatever. But ultimately, they also assumed all legal responsibility from there forward. So if it failed below the water table and suddenly you get something coming up and intermixing with the water, then you have a problem. And, obviously there's an argument in many states as to who has the responsibility for this. So our work areas were in 3 counties. Pecos County, which had the largest grouping of older wells dating from the 20s up through the 60s and possibly 70s for some reentry. Then we had a ranch that crossed over into Ward and Crane County, or it bordered those 2 counties. And then another one in Upton County. Now this one had slightly newer wells, and then this one had mostly newer wells, but all of them had issues with older P&A wells and issues with leaking wells. So the study that we'll talk about a little bit here, that's this area, and the red dots are the coordinates that we pulled from the regulatory agency, and the yellow dots are the coordinates that we arrived at through forensic work and digging through information. The breakdown on that was that there were 75 wells in total. 28 of them had pump jack and wellheads visible. 39 of them were P&A wells. One was never drilled. 7 of them were defined as orphan wells, one of which was in the regulatory agency's data store. 6 were not. Of those 3 we found on legacy topographic maps, and 3 from records in the Midland Energy Library, just going through research on well names and status. So when we finished with our research and the determination of our positions, we did a comparison to the regulatory agency, and we had 1 well that we agreed with exactly the same. However, all the rest, we had differences to them, roughly in the range of 36 feet to 670 feet, with an average of 221 feet. Now, I can say that we also looked at a number of other sources of geolocation data for the same wells, and we found differences in most all of them. Some were a lot better, some were worse, so that the issue then becomes you have multiple silos for the same information, coming up with locations that are different, but not by the same amount. So you might plot a map and see the locations in 3 different places for the same well. This one that we looked at was one of the ones that was fairly high. It was 197 feet different from the Railroad Commission, and this position was backed into by historical imagery as well as using documented survey from the past. Now let's look at another issue that we discovered while we were doing the work. This particular diagram is a patent from 1913 for a gas-powered band wheel that was used to pump multiple wells surrounding the band wheel. And it had offset rods on it, so as it turned, different rods would pump different wells, and you would get actuate a pumping mechanism. This image over here is a current image showing the old band wheel. This is one and only well bore that was visible. Obviously, it wasn't capped. We know that there are likely multiple wells surrounding this band well, because they wouldn't have put something this expensive in the day to do just one well. And this well was drilled in the 1920s, abandoned by the operator. The landowner has this, basically trash, although I'm sure there's a museum or 2 that wouldn't mind getting their hands on it, but it's still not a very cheap job to get rid of all this stuff off the property. Now let's look at something a little newer. This particular well was plugged abandoned, I believe in 2021. They put a water monitoring post at the site according to P&A requirements. We looked for the well in older imagery, and we could find it, the actual well here. This was the position from the regulatory agency. Down here we can see again a close-up of the pump jack, and this is where the water monitoring post was placed. Now this is all completely covered over. Sometime in the future, it'll be even harder to determine anything. Hopefully this will stay there, although it may be a problem because in the regulatory commission, even months and years after this is done, this is still the position that's being maintained. So we have a carry forward of the problem. And that's one of the big issues that we're worried about is, how long do these problems stay? And even if you do go properly do a reclamation of an area that's problematic, what's going to happen with the coordinates? Are they going to be updated, or are they just going to stay incorrect? One of the bigger problems, this is Bomer Lake, which is the only saltwater lake in Texas. And that's so far. I can say something about Texas is there's only one natural lake in the entire state, and that's Caddo Lake. All the rest are man-made. This too is man-made. It was originally a stock tank. A leaking well started pumping salt brine into the lake, and it becomes saltier and saltier, and it expands in size. It's already crossed an access road. There's a big debate within the state as to who's responsible for this particular problem. There are nearby sinkholes that exist, one of them which crosses a major road that's going to have to be fixed, and they're going to move the road around the sinkhole at a cost of about $35 million. And who knows how many other wells exist out here. This particular orphan well is 1 mile northeast of that. It too is a stock tank. It started out as a water well, handed over to the landowner at the original P&A time. It failed below water table lines and started leaking sulfur and other chemicals out into the stock tank, loss of cattle, loss of environment, and responsibility put onto the landowner to solve the particular problem. Now, what got us interested in this to begin with was this particular event, which occurred in December of 2021, actually New Year's Eve. It erupted a 100-foot geyser into the air, a salt geyser. 4 days later, this photo was taken. This is the white effect on the land. It's not winter, or it is winter, but it's not snow. It took months to identify the wells, who was responsible, and then to get action to do something about the particular problem. When they did start to dig out the area around it to try to plug it, they discovered a second well offset 10 feet away. Through a lot of work and a lot of research by many, many people, it was ultimately found that there were 2 wells drilled as core tests, one of which failed during the time they drilled it, so they plugged it. And then they offset and drilled a second one, got the information they were after, and then plugged that and covered them both up. That was probably in the 60s, maybe 70s, not sure. However, the issue is that high pressure salt water found this plugged well, found its way to the surface and created this geyser. And they haven't been able, or at least as of the last check, they weren't able to complete plugging this for permanent because they don't know the source of the pressure. And ongoing costs to work through this problem were at its peak about $250,000 a day, which kind of blows the $19,000 per well average. And the landowner lost cattle, certainly has surface growth damage There's actually a windmill over here to pump up from another water well and fill a stock tank. There's suspicions that family members may have developed health and life issues due to the corrupted water table. And whatever the outcome, obviously the negative image to the oil and gas industry and the regulatory agency is significant. And it's one that caught our attention, and the reason that we decided to form G Forensic and go out and start doing some work to see what the magnitude of these issues and how geolocation misrepresentation played into this. So our conclusions were that geolocations in most public domain data stores, commercial data stores, and probably in most oil and gas company data stores are misrepresentations of the actual locations. And we've done this in our working careers and found this to be true of a vast majority of older wells. And it's due to all the factors that previously mentioned. The data exists in some fashion for a majority of wells. However, it requires a lot of research to find the information. There's no single source of information that's complete. And so it's not easy work, but it is work that can be done. Ownership and liability is just as hard to determine, and the impact of that varies across states. We found that there's a failure to correct misrepresentation, even when they could. So that's an ongoing problem. All the efforts to date that we've seen have been reactive, and there's a lady by the name of Sarah Strogner who advocates for landowners, and she called this fixing of orphan wells whack-a-mole after a child's game, where you hit a pop-up and another appears somewhere else. And I'll show you whack-a-mole. And if you think about this, if one of these mole holes starts shooting up a geyser and there's multiple wells around it that were drilled using the same technology, were probably P&A'd in exactly the same way, what's the possibility for another eruption to occur? And so does it make sense to fix one, go somewhere else, and then wait for another one to fail to fix it? And how long is that going to go on? So what steps should be taken to solve these problems? We've written a study which details this a lot more. It also describes a lot of the subject matter that I've talked about today. But basically, it starts with resolving the public domain data, because that's the most accessible data by so many people, and it's used by so many as truth. And in doing so, you have to involve domain expertise. So it can't just be some GIS group in some regulatory body that's tasked with loading data, and there is no process in place which allows them to understand the issues. And you should classify all wells, because it isn't just the old legacy wells that potentially have the problem. And there's no way for any one well to be properly defined as having accuracy and integrity. Then you go through the archives for the wells that aren't in the public domain database, and that often is the old P&A legacy wells, because there's no value to a regulatory agency for those wells. There's only cost. So they don't do a lot of work with historical data. They're more interested in the stuff that they have taxing revenues and permitting revenues. And they address the issue of orphan wells with bonding requirements, which are obviously way too low for the potential impact of what's out there. Once you could do these old data, you want to assign API or unique well identifier numbers and then build up the same data access and information that exists for the other wells. Finally, you identify the missing wells which require field location. If you remember the band wheel, there's other wells around that you're not going to spot just walking around. There may not be any paperwork that shows where they were. So you might have to go to the field and use a magnetometer, or you might be doing methane sniffing, or whatever the technology is that you can apply to finding those locations. But you want to find those as a group. You just don't want to go off and do everything. You want to do the ones that need that type of the work and that type of cost. Then once you've done it, you make that data available, and there's commercial ways to do that. We talk a little bit about it in the paper that we wrote. Then you exchange the data properly using a proper format. The IOGP produced the P7 format. I was honored to be on the commission to help define that format to make it align with the other exchange formats for seismic, shallow water data, all kinds of different positioning information. And this is a very good format to be able to do something other than file a document and a survey plat. Although those are necessary things, it's still better to have data exchange in a proper format. Then you establish data governance. Finally, I want to talk about what it is that you can do. And this is very, very critical. We are all geomatics people. We have backgrounds in survey, in geodesy, in data management. But at our core, we understand location. And so we have to ensure geolocation integrity from the very start. And we have to educate users on what geolocation is, what integrity is in the data, what attributes should follow every data set. We've done a good job in most cases of at least defining coordinate reference systems, although you still see people, sending out spreadsheets with just a list of coordinates. You need for wells to understand the footprint and know that it doesn't end with P&A. It goes forward in time. And so that data has to retain its integrity way beyond the use life cycle. And then there's the importance of the non-visible wells, because these are the ones that are going to keep causing problems and are going to require reactive things to take care of them. And then understand that poor geolocation reflects on us as a community. And while the three of us that are in geoforensic have decades of work and experience, I can tell you that as hard as we've done things, people have done a very good job of taking our efforts and making them look really bad. So we have to try to stop that sort of activity. The other is to encourage sharing of the geolocation data. Many entities still feel like that's proprietary. Maybe the wellbore information and location is proprietary, but the surface location should be readily exchanged without issue. And in fact, if you think about the integrity of that location, what does it do to the wellbore positions? Okay, and then finally, either if you have the power, establish data governance. If you don't, advocate for data governance. And if you see somebody that is attempting to put a plan in place, make sure that they have the domain knowledge supporting them to be able to do a good job of that. With that, the grumpy geriatric team, thank you for allowing us to do this presentation. We are the three people that are involved in it, although many other people have helped us. Bruce has 40 years as a licensed land surveyor and has worked worldwide and for many different companies, including his own. I ran a company for 40 years, dealing primarily with problem position issues and geolocation issues. Jackie has worked 30 years running Santos, dealing with these kind of problems in Canada and in the US, and has used applied geodetics and geolocation in field applications. Feel free to reach out to us at these email addresses. And if you have any questions, the three of us are actually online and we're happy to answer those questions. And with that, Alex, you can take control.
Thank you so much, Mr. Connor, for your presentation. Well, now we have time just for a QA section. Remember, you can still leave your comments and questions in the question section. We already have some questions from the audience. Let me read it for you. I don't know if you can read it, but the first question said, how certain will be that the statement, the wells being drilled today are the potential orphan well for the future?
I mean, obviously, in the 1970s, the requirements for P&A were strengthened. They became more universal in their requirements and things like monitoring sites. But I'll go back to the one slide I showed you. We don't know where that well is. Its geolocation is still the same as it was originally, which is wrong. There's a water monitoring post, which who knows what that will look like in 100 years. And we don't know what sort of issues exist subsurface that may possibly cause uncertainty in what's happening. We have earthquakes, we have faults, we have all kinds of issues that may in the future cause this. But our concern primarily here is how well do we know where our wells are? And every well that's being put into a regulatory body, what is the accompanying information that guarantees where that location is?
Okay. All right. A second question said, are the regulatory office at the state or federal levels in the USA taking the necessary measures nowadays to prevent those kind of issues to happen in the future?
I think that the higher that you go up in regulations, the further you get away from domain expertise. So my opinion is that they, and I welcome Jackie and Bruce to share their feelings on it, but I think they take positions as gospel. And I know Jackie has a great line to address geolocation gospel. You care to say anything, Jackie?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, well, the father of GIS, I'm a Canadian American, Dr. Tomlinson. I went to one of his very first seminars in the early 1980s in Ottawa, and he made a profound statement that I carry to this day. And he said, remember this digital world that we're going into, that it will be garbage in but gospel out. And that is so true. As soon as data becomes digital, everyone believes it. And our concern is, and we talk about the wells of today that get P&A'd will be the orphan wells of tomorrow. Everything is going to have a geolocation representation, and everyone is going to use that. More so than, and the historical information that support that will be harder and harder to access. So Dr. Tomlinson, who obviously is no longer with us, he is so right. And our new generation really believes coordinates until they get hurt by it. And what John is talking about is that well that he just showed with a monitor station. I've actually been out there. We could identify that proper location through imagery. But when I went out to that field, the only evidence I know of that wellbore is I look at that monitor station. My first assumption, that's the wellbore, because I have no knowledge until I talked to the landowner and the rancher. So the original well is mislocated hundreds of feet. The monitor is 3. In fact, they have I was just out there last week and they've excavated the wellbore, which is 35 feet away from that monitor station, because the rancher is concerned about the subsurface activity. So they're actually excavating all the old P&A wells, and we're facilitating, helping them with the proper geolocations. In fact, I've been out the past week observing with the high-end GNS Trimble receiver, and I'm collecting data at those wellbores. So the question that was asked previous about what do you mean? Well, if the geolocation of the wellbore is incorrect today and it's plugged and abandoned and non-visible, how do you find it tomorrow? It's like finding a needle in a haystack. So that's my part of this, but I really it set with me from 1980s Dr. Tomlinson's message about the garbage in, gospel out. And because once it's digital, everybody believes it. And look at social media. Whatever you read, oh, that's got to be right. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
All right. Thank you. The last question that I have is, are you aware if those kind of issues are also happening in other countries? If yes, what are they doing differently to prevent them?
The answer is yes. And I don't think many of us know what they're doing differently, because most other countries either have state-owned control, and so that would be like my diagram of multiple companies where you have internal control of the data by one entity, but it's still passed around to the others. For foreign drilling, for sure, you have the problem of historically that was done by U.S. countries, I'm sorry, by West countries, and they probably retained the records. They may have given some copies, but you don't know how that's handled. But I honestly believe, and I've seen it in some of the work I've done, that the geolocation misrepresentation is common throughout the world.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll add to John's statement, also the geolocation, and obviously working in different countries, Venezuela, South America, the multiple datums and projections that could be used and are used. The other statement that sticks with me is the more the data changes hands, the more things can go wrong. Because as a user, you make the assumption, oh, it was this, but it may have been something else. So that's just a word of cautionary. Don't always believe what you see or what you read. But my experience as head surveyor for Mobile Oil and working a lot all over the world like John and Bruce, the same problem exists, particularly, especially for legacy data.
All right. Well, since we don't have further question, we'd like to thank again John Connor and also your partner for the invest time assistance with this webinar. We would like to present you. Let me just change the presenter. So, can you see my screen?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we would like to, on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to thank you, everybody. Well, first, just this is the certification of appreciation for you and for your time, for your work, which I have to add my personal comment. This look like a part of the CSI team job.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you. Like that.
No, excellent. And I enjoy your presentation and your material. What else? Well, since this one is whatever we have, on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to thank you everybody who joined today, and we hope you found this conference beneficial and valuable. The next webinar of this second conference on applied geodesic engineering is tomorrow, Saturday, October 29th at 5 p.m. Venezuelan time, 4 p.m. Central Time, by Luisana Osorio, named Proyecto Seabed 2030 de la Fundación Nippon JEPCO. This webinar will be held in Spanish, and in order to participate, please, you may use the same link as you did today. More information will be available on our social media platform. That's all for today. Take care of yourself and see you tomorrow. Saludos por el mundo.
Yep, salute.
Yep. Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it very much.
All right.
Have a good day and watch the Astros tonight.
Yeah, exactly. Go Astros.
Goodbye.
All right, take care.